James Gunn is back on Twitter and he wasted no time in showing us a beautiful graphic novel that he's been sent. Jeff Loeb's Superman for All Season. Now this is a very, very unique graphic novel. If you're a die-hard Superman fan, you would have heard of this graphic novel before. In fact, it's the graphic novel that inspired Smallville. So I have never read this graphic novel before, so I thought it'd be interesting to give it a read. And after we talk about all of this, we discuss what went wrong with the DCEU and what are the differences to what James Gunn is planning to what the original DCEU was planning with Zack Snyder, David Goyer, and Christopher Nolan. The differences of mentalities. One mentality is to basically say, this is our world, a ready, breathing DC universe that you all can come into. And another one is a kind of artistic take at Superman and DC that's not for everyone. So let's have a look what Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb is all about. Because James Gunn has said that Superman Legacy is partially inspired by this graphic novel. Superman for All Seasons. A boy becomes a man. So it's about that journey, which was exactly what Smallville was all about. A small-scale, heartwarming comic that will make a fan out of even the most jaded Superman hater. And that's the point. And that is the same point that James Gunn is attempting to do with Superman Legacy. Because, oh boy, you know, Superman can do with all the fans he can get. It's been a very long journey for Superman since 1938. And the glory of Superman 78, which made new fans. The glory of Smallville that created new fans. And since then, it's become very, very jaded and no one's exactly known what to do to make this character relatable. I think if you've got an imagination, it's achievable and it's not even that difficult. To an outsider, Superman is not an easy character to like. He's an all-powerful Boy Scout with a stupid disguise and a cheesy suit. Even more ardent superhero and DC comic fans can find it hard to find a Superman tale that makes the Man of Steel more appealing. It takes a specific kind of creator to pinpoint and flesh out the characteristics that make this icon arguably the greatest superhero of all time. The acclaimed creative duo of writer Jeff Loeb, who actually consulted on Smallville, not just consulted on Smallville, but during seasons 4 and 5, I think, not 6, I don't think, but he consulted with the Smallville writers' room. And if you've got the box sets, you can see a documentary called The Writers' Room. You should really check it out. It's a lot of fun. And artist Tim Sale accompanied such a feat by, scaling back the super and just focusing on the man. Superman for All Seasons is the story of a boy growing up to be a man and the responsibilities that come with that. It is an intimate and timeless tale that any person of any age could enjoy and relate to, that just happens to be about a superhero who grew up on a farm. Writing and plot. Superman for All Seasons watches Clark Kent as he struggles to define himself and leave his family farm to become the hero of Metropolis, all the while maintaining the values and manner installed in him by his humble beginnings. The four-issue story that make up the basically the comic and the graphic novel are told from the perspective of a different person in Clark's life. His father, Jonathan Kent, his co-worker and future lover, Lois Lane, and arch nemesis, Lex Luthor, and his high school sweetheart, Lana Lang. The series takes place over the course of a year, with each issue representing a season. The four issues each pose a different internal or external conflict that a young Superman has to evolve past. Despite the fact that the comic is told from the perspective of other people, it still clearly is an introspective on Kal-El in these pages. The boy from Smallville decides to become a hero, learns what responsibilities that basically entails that walk of life back to his decision, and then is reminded by those who raised him as to why he does what he does. Writer Jeff Loeb has proven himself to be a tour de force, and he has. And basically, that's what Superman for All Seasons is all about. Again, my reading wasn't great. It's not really my reading. I've got a really bad phone with a really bad screen, but I'm trying it. So basically, this was the graphic novel that basically inspired Smallville. So it's interesting because Smallville does kind of do what this comic does. It shows you the perspectives of all characters. It shows you Jonathan Kent's perspective, the fear he has in people finding out about Clark, and then you've got Martha, this wholesome kind of old-fashioned mother who makes apple pies, loves her son, but was once in Metropolis and wanted to be a businesswoman. You've got the Lex Luthor story before, prior to him becoming an evil megalomaniac, and the friendship him and Clark have. But this show really, if it tells anyone's perspective, it's Clark Kent's perspective, which Clark and Tom are in most of the scenes of each episode. So Smallville really take this Superman for All Seasons comic and they really put it in the live action arena, and they do a great job of it for 10 seasons. Absolutely amazing. And James Gunn is partially inspired for Superman Legacy by this graphic novel. But why? Because this is a comic, a very famous comic, a very popular comic, because it takes this character and it kind of explains him to people who never really got him. There are a lot of people who just don't like Superman. They don't get him. They don't like him because apparently he's too nice. He's too powerful. This is the biggest facade I've ever heard in explanations why people don't actually like Superman. Because surely if someone's good and pure and he can fly and he's got powers, you've got the gee whiz element and you've got the example of a good man. But unfortunately for too long we've lived in a devolved society that looks up to bad people rather than good people, right? Batman isn't a bad person, but he's a damaged person. He's bitter, and he does things a certain way. And there's a reality about Batman, and there's wish fulfillment about Superman. I said this the other day. Superman is the genie in the bottle that gives you a chance. He's not a character you're going to find in the real world. He's a character you find in your imagination. So you can't really put Superman in the real world. We'll get there at the moment when we talk about what went wrong with the DCEU, and that's partially the reason the DCEU and the Snyderverse didn't work for everyone. So with James Gunn being inspired by this comic, what is he going to attempt to do? He's going to attempt to do exactly what Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale did with Superman for All Seasons. Is basically say, this is Superman. This is who he is. We're not ashamed that he's good and all-powerful. You can be all-powerful and you can be good at the same time. Now it's interesting. Lex Luthor says in Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, you can't be all good and all-powerful at the same time. Now this is interesting because is this what, the writer of Batman vs Superman actually believes, or were these the ramblings of the lunatic that is Lex Luthor. It's interesting, isn't it? You can't be all good if you're all powerful. But that is who Superman is. He can be all good and he can be all powerful at the same time. And that's a lot for people to wrap their heads around, some people. But I think if you do a good story, like Superman for All Seasons, which Superman Legacy is inspired by, partially, it's inspired by All-Star Superman as well. So it's going to be interesting what they do here. Very, very interesting. But yeah, what Gunn's looking at here is telling a pure Superman story that basically, relates to a lot of people. That you can be a good guy. He's just going to tell a wholesome, good story. Instead of saying, well, Superman would, Superman would, some people would love him, some people would hate him, not everyone would embrace him. You see, this is the difference between what James Gunn is attempting to do in the aesthetics and the values that James Gunn holds dear in terms of comics and telling comic book stories. Where Zack Snyder wanted Superman to prove himself, to earn the right to become Superman. So the idea is that we see him in Man of Steel, he becomes the hero, but then it's a bit weird because at the end of this film, they're smiling in the Daily Planet, welcome to the planet. You think it's going to get a little bit more, lighter in the second movie, in the sequel. We get Batman versus Superman, where half the world despises Superman and is questioning Superman. Should he be acting unilaterally? Now, in the real world, again, these questions would be posed. But this is the problem with putting Superman in the real world. It's part of the reason the DCEU suffered and never could get out of the hole it was digging itself. Because WB wanted to make Marvel Studios MCU money. But they brought in Goyer and Nolan. Nolan in turn brought in Snyder. Once you bring those kind of creatives in, they're looking at the story, the artistic element of making a story. They're not looking at being faithful to the comics. They want to tell their story and they want to be left alone to tell their story. Here's the problem. The studio wants to make money. The studio is within its rights to want to make money, but the auteur wants to make art. So there should be a place for works of art that don't make a lot of money, and there should be a place for big blockbusters that do make money. Without the blockbusters, you can't make the small movies. Not every artistic movie can be Oppenheimer. But is that even possible today when you've got the media and consumers and fans basically waving stats about, this Rotten Tomato scores, this box office, and if a film doesn't make $1 billion these days, fans, critics and media deem it as a failure. How can we get away from this? How can we go back to the old days where we had cheap movies that were artistic and then we had the big blockbusters, right? Because you need both. You need both. You need art. There should be art. There should be these art-driven movies like the Dark Knight trilogy, like Snyder's planned 5-story arc. But the problem is WB wanted a mainstream cinematic universe that made the same money, even more maybe, than the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But by allowing Nolan to take control of the situation, there was a problem. If you notice, Nolan and Goyer wasn't involved with Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice. So I would love to ask David Goyer what were his plans for a Man of Steel sequel. I would be very, very interested. As you know, I love the Snyderverse, but in terms of a business, instead of chasing, when you're chasing that money, you can't bring in people like Zack Snyder, Christopher Nolan, and David Goyer, because their idea and their motivations are not chasing money and box office, right? With someone like James Gunn, he's going to do both. Now we know so far he's made one DC movie and it failed during COVID. Nobody knows if the James Gunn plan will work, but he's attempting to reintroduce Superman to the world and make him relatable by saying this, this is Superman. He wears tights, he wears a costume, he wears red trunks. That might be silly to some of you, but give him a chance. Basically, telling a wholesome story about a wholesome character. Whereas I say, Zack Snyder is telling the story of where Superman has to earn the right to become the Superman we know and love. So, as I say, so basically he goes from Man of Steel fighting his own people to BVS, where he ends up being impaled by a creature, and that's not enough. He still has to earn his right to be the Superman we know and love, because in Justice League 2 he goes under the control of Darkseid. He sees the woman of his dreams, Lois Lane, getting burnt alive by Darkseid. He doesn't know Darkseid does it. Darkseid manipulates him and uses the anti-life equation to control him. Then Superman becomes the villain. So by the time we get to Justice League 3, probably in the last half an hour of the movie, Superman leads a meta-human army against Darkseid. So basically, you would end up seeing very little of the Superman you know and love. And there lies the problem. And this is why the Snyderverse was utterly polarizing. This is why Man of Steel didn't make the money it should have made. Because if they just, thought about it and were looking for the box office as well as telling a good artistic story, they could have both made an artistic story and made money. But Snyder doesn't do that. Snyder doesn't bend. Nolan doesn't bend. Goya doesn't bend. So what you're doing is, and I love Man of Steel, you start off from a weakened position. Then it becomes worse with Batman vs Superman, which is a huger, darker, more polarizing movie than Man of Steel. You've already polarized your audience by doing what you did in Man of Steel, by having Superman break Zod's neck, by having Superman not seem really interested in the collateral damage around him. It's a problem. And all of a sudden, people are thinking, are these the right people to be making these types of movies? As I say, there should be a place for Zack Snyder's 5-movie arc, but not for the general audience, not for the mainstream audience. The studio told the public and the media that they were chasing Marvel. They wanted to create a cinematic universe as Marvel and Feige did. That's the problem. So the public are making the assumption that it's for them. It's for Superman fans, it's for DC fans, that they're basically trying to do exactly what Marvel are doing. But that's not what Snyder, Goya and Nolan and Terrio were attempting to do. They were making art. Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman and Zack Snyder's Justice League Snyder Cut are visual masterpieces about physical gods, specimens, the hero's journey. That's the story they were attempting to do, especially Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder was trying to give DC the Lord of the Rings treatment. But by doing that, because the problem is Zack Snyder isn't Peter Jackson, let's be clear about this, and he doesn't believe in being faithful with source material. We saw that with BVS. He's already admitted that The Dark Knight Returns is one of his favourite graphic novels. But what did he do with it? He created Batman vs Superman, and he didn't make a faithful adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, and that's one of his most favourite graphic novels. I've said this before in another video. Wouldn't it have been better for Zack Snyder to take Batman vs Superman and just make it a faithful adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns? But no, instead, we get Batman vs Superman that splits the fandom, splits audiences, because directors like Zack Snyder and Rian Johnson love subverting expectations. In other words, they get off on winding people up. Basically, they get off on shaving against the grain. I love Zack Snyder. I love the Snyderverse. I'm just spitting some truths here. Because Zack Snyder hasn't got the same kind of storytelling morality as Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson came in and gave us a Lord of the Rings trilogy that was as faithful to the source material as possible. And if any adaptation is hard to do and be faithful to the source material, it's those stories, it's those books, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, Return of the King. They're near impossible stories to adapt. But Jackson and his team did it. and they were impeccable, and they pleased the Tolkien fans. But not only did they please the Tolkien fans, this was a trilogy that brought in the general audience as well, which nobody thought was possible actually. But Zack Snyder isn't like that. So you've brought in a director. First we go, basically, the DCEU started by Goya having writer's block on The Dark Knight Rises and coming up with a Superman story idea. A first contact story. He goes to Nolan, Nolan goes to the studio. Obviously the studio loved Nolan. They thought, yeah, this is money to print. Of course they were wrong, because of the story that Goya wanted to tell in the way he wanted to tell it. It was David Goya's idea for Superman to snap Zod's neck, not Zack Snyder. Obviously Snyder must have approved of the idea. It's right up his alley. But what you're doing, you're shaving against the grain. You're polarizing audiences. You're subverting expectations, and in the end, you can't win. Because if you want to subvert expectations, if you want to make art, and those types of stories, you can't be doing it in a franchise that the studio want to attract a general audience. And this is why the DCEU went wrong. And after BVS polarized audiences, they didn't know what to do next, because Man of Steel didn't make the money, didn't make a profit. Man of Steel made $650. By the time everything was said and done, marketing, everything, it barely made a profit. Zack Snyder movies are very, very expensive. They're beautiful, but they're very, very expensive. So and this is what happens as well. Superman, the character, was getting the blame for these failures. This is why they rested Superman after Justice League. They blamed Superman for Justice League. So what happens is, after BVS, the studio are driven to make dumb, crazy decisions because they've got this Suicide Squad movie which scares the shit out of them. So they interfere with it, they rewrite it, they redo it, and they shelve the director's, David Ayer's, original vision, because after BVS they don't know what to do next. And then the review for the movie that they redid was terrible, but the movie made a lot of money. And then we went to Wonder Woman, where Zack Snyder co-wrote and ghost-directed a lot of that as well. Wonder Woman 2017 is one of my favourite CBMs ever. I think it's an amazing film, but they interfered with that as well, out of nerves. You can't blame the studio for being nervous, but the studio and that regime should have known from the beginning not to bring in Christopher Nolan, not to do a DC cinematic universe. And if Nolan and Goya want to shape a DC cinematic universe, they've got to stay there. They've got to write all of these movies. They've got to be involved with all of these movies. But after Man of Steel, and because Man of Steel didn't make the money the studio wanted, Goya and Nolan walked away, and Zack Snyder had the keys to the kingdom and was allowed to do whatever he wanted. Now, as I say, I love BVS. I love the Snyder trilogy. But at the end of the day, that's not the way you're going to make money. That's not the way you're going to chase Marvel. And that's the problem. As I say, there should be a place to make art, but to make money as well. There's got to be a balance. And there wasn't a balance here. So what is James Gunn attempting to do? James Gunn knew when he came in, he had a hard gig, and a lot of the Snyder stands were going to come after him. His problem is his historical tweets and all his sins are there for everyone to see, and they keep on exposing more and more. And this is why he hasn't been on Twitter for a very, very long time. But James Gunn's responsibility and job is to make a cinematic universe that celebrates DC. A cinematic universe for everyone. Now, bless the Snyderverse stands. I love you. You know, I love your director. I don't have a director. I just love DC. I love Snyder's DC movies. You know I do. But they live in an echo chamber. They don't really care about servicing all the fans, the general audience, you know, hardcore DC comic book fans. They don't care about those people. They just care about their director coming back and restoring the Snyderverse. It's all they think about night and day. So this is sometimes why they're labelled as not real DC fans. Now, I think if you love something that's from DC, you're a DC fan, and that's fine. But of course, we can't carry on like this, whether you like it or not, James Gunn is going to make a Superman movie. He's going to direct Superman Legacy, which is inspired by a pure comic like Superman for All Seasons. This is the way they believe they can reintroduce Superman to the world, but in a more wholesome way. And they're hoping by showing, the world Superman's goodness and gee whiz qualities that people will be more receptive to this character. This is the thing. Is there money in a Superman film? Because Superman 78 made money, Superman 2 made money, Superman 3 didn't make as much money but still made a profit, did really well, 100 million, but they were released at the same time as Raiders of the Lost Ark, that film, Superman 3. And so, yeah, those first 3 movies made money. Superman 4 was a flop, as we already know. Superman Returns basically probably just made its money back. Man of Steel just about made a profit, but not anything to brag about. A Superman movie's got to be making more than that. And as I say, if you compare the money in the financials for Superman the movie, it's about $2 billion in today's terms. So Superman the movie is a huge hit. As I said the other day, there's no debating that. You can go on and on and on, and you can do what you want. You can wave stats at me from the Snyderverse. Here's the facts. That I'm glad the Snyderverse exists, but at the end of the day, it's polarizing as part of the mainstream. But Zack Snyder doesn't make movies for the mainstream. This is the problem. If you want Snyder to make an artistic DC franchise, put him in a corner, let him do that. But putting him in charge of the DCEU, which the studio themselves wanted to be for the mainstream, was the biggest fuck up of all time. And they haven't got out of the situation that's been created. Because you start with Man of Steel polarizing, BVS polarizing, Justice League, a mess. And, a horrible way of dealing with situations. But the studio were put in such a corner, such a situation, that the more movies Snyder made, the worse it was going to get. Because the general audience were never going to accept what he was doing. Especially if he got his own way. Like, imagine if he actually did, give us that affair between Bruce Wayne and Lois Lane. People would have went fucking mad. This is the problem. These are the type of things that you have to do as an alternate universe. As something that's just standalone, not part of a mainstream universe. You could have done the very thing that James Gunn is attempting to do now, a mainstream cinematic universe to please as many people as possible, and have Zack Snyder in a little corner. But the problem is, how many Supermen, how many Batmen can you have? I believe that James Gunn wants to recast Aquaman, and I think that James Gunn is going to cast Jason Momoa as Lobo to soften the blow. And Lobo, who is a huge Superman villain in the comics, will be in Superman Legacy. And I think Momoa is going to be fucking excellent. But I still think you should support Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom because I think it's a good movie. Now, don't get me wrong. The cut I saw, I really, really liked. Who knows what we're going to get in the end. But ultimately, the DCEU doesn't matter. These films are going, have nearly all been released. It's just Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Whatever happens, happens. And I think the studio and Gunn are at a place now, they're thinking, do you know what? Fuck it, right? Let's go on this new direction and let's see if we can create something really exciting and really good. As I said before, there's 10% of me that's really excited in what James Gunn's doing, in the potential of creating a wholesome, exciting cinematic universe. But then there's a voice in my head saying to me, how can this possibly work? I want it to work because I love DC. And at the end of the day, the only way to shut up us doubters is for James Gunn to make a great Superman movie that celebrates DC and celebrates this brilliant character that I've adored since I've been a small boy. Where would I be now without Superman? I probably wouldn't even be alive. This character got me through a lot of dark days, being bullied at school, suffering with learning disabilities, being poked fun at for having dyslexia and mental illness and all of that. This is why so many children today suffer with depression because the characters that are being adapted for them are being made in today's terms. So there's no escapism. And that's why more people are suffering with depression today. So I'm not basically writing James Gunn and his plan off right now. He's talking a very, very good game. It's also very sad that Zack Snyder wasn't allowed to finish what he started. But ultimately, what has happened has happened. I'm still going to enjoy the Snyderverse and what we got from it, but I'm also going to look forward to what James Gunn is planning. We're getting a new Superman movie. Whatever that is, I'm still very excited to find out what that is.